certainly recognise that even if someone gives consent, if it's clearly contrary to their best interests, the fact that they've given consent doesn't validate you in acting contrary to their best interests. So it looks as if there's been a long-standing recognition that best interest can trump consent. So the idea that consent is the primary way of, or the sole way of protecting your interests doesn't look as if it's quite the right story. And I'm inclined to think actually that the idea of consent as protection of best interests is really the wrong way of looking at consent. The primary consent is about control, not about best interests at all, really. But that's a slightly stronger claim. And so far as confidentiality is concerned, certainly in psychiatric ethics, the idea that you can disclose confidential information in the public interest has been recognised. So there's been a notion of the public interest knocking around there as well. And in the professions, generally speaking, the commitment to act in the public interest has been a tremendously powerful part of professional ethics for a very long time. So the notion of the public interest seems to have been there in the professions, anyhow, generally speaking, for a long time.
Okay, I shall try and get all the bits of that, the many bits of that question. Versus control or best interest, I think while best interest is often talked about, in many instances, particularly when you think globally, in fact, it isn't concerned about participants' best interests. And so informed consent, even though I think, as I explained, was put together intending to protect the individual, actually has just become an easy way to tick the ethical box, and it's not concerned with best interest, and it's not in any way thinking about those wider concerns. It's just saying you chose it, you ticked the consent box, on your head be it. So I think it's a failure to look at best interests in the way that it's often practiced. I mean, I think that one has to distinguish between the different types of informed consent, and often in this instance one gets told, oh well, that's a straw man, because this is what Soren alluded to in terms of Kantian autonomy. Autonomy is not like this. Autonomy is a great big concept, and you have to be concerned with your own interests as well as other interests, and it has to take place over a lifetime. But those things are not what happens in practice. In practice, it's just about, did you say yes to this? Right, that's it. You consented. We're in the clear. So, I'm not arguing that there aren't some notions of consent that are richer and better, but we haven't found ones that work in practice well. So I think that control argument is less important than the best interest argument, and it's in order to protect best interest that we actually need not just the consent process, which I think has actually deteriorated to a choice where that choice has no real meaning. That's kind of a whole big argument packed into 2 sentences. In terms of the public interest in the way that it's done in terms of revealing something about a psychiatric patient, it's relatively small, those kind of disclosures. So if you think, for instance, about something like reproductive ethics and what doctors have to look at in terms of the welfare of the child, it's basically they only have to check that somebody doesn't have a criminal record and history of abuse. That's a very small version of public interest, and it's not these big group goods. So there are instances, particularly in public health ethics, where we do think about big group goods, and that would be in things like, is it all right to control somebody's movement in a pandemic in order to address public interests. But again, they're still really quite limited. I mean, one obvious area would be vaccination. We still allow people not to be vaccinated at a threat of herd immunity, which from a kind of public good and individual good perspective is slightly insane. So, there is this trumping of individual choice, even when it's against not only your best interest, but everybody else's as well. So that would be my whistle-stop answer to that question.
Stop there. Thank you for that. So I suggest that we take an additional, we reconvene at 5 to 11. That gives us 20 minutes for coffee. Is that all right, Ruth? Because we have quite a lot of time for lunch, I think. Okay, so back at 5 to 11, please. Thank you.